Rick Carter wiped the grease off his hands with a rag that was probably dirtier than his hands were, and stared at the pile of broken equipment scattered across his tiny workshop on Kepler 9 station. The place was a mess. Alien power converters that had burned out, navigation units with fried circuits, atmosphere regulators that wheezed and sputtered, and about a dozen other pieces of junk that various species had dumped on him to fix. 3 years. 3 long years he'd been stuck here on this frontier station at the edge of civilized space, fixing alien trash for credits that barely covered his rent and food. 3 years of watching ships come and go through the docking bays while he stayed trapped in his cramped workshop, dreaming of somewhere else. Kepler 9 wasn't the worst place in the galaxy, but it was pretty far down the list. The station orbited a dead planet nobody wanted, serving as a waypoint for traders, smugglers, and various species who needed to refuel or resupply before heading deeper into unexplored space. The air recyclers never worked quite right, so everything smelled faintly of burnt plastic. The artificial gravity fluctuated randomly, making your stomach lurch at unexpected moments. And the whole place had a depressing atmosphere of people who'd ended up here because they had nowhere better to go. Rick fell into that category, unfortunately. He was good with his hands, always had been. Back on Earth, growing up in a small town outside Houston, his dad had run a repair shop fixing everything from farm equipment to old cars. Rick had spent his childhood in that shop, learning that any machine could be fixed if you understood how it worked and weren't afraid to get creative. His dad used to say that machines were just puzzles, and every problem had a solution if you were patient and stubborn enough to find it. That skill had kept Rick fed and housed on Kepler 9, but it hadn't gotten him what he really wanted. His own ship. The freedom to go wherever he pleased. The ability to leave this depressing station and see what was actually out there in the galaxy, instead of just hearing stories from the traders who passed through. But ships cost money. Real money. And Rick was broke. Had been broke for 3 years straight, ever since he'd arrived on Kepler 9 with big dreams and empty pockets. Every credit he earned went to rent, food, and tools to keep his workshop running. There was never anything left over for savings, much less enough to buy even the smallest, oldest, most beat-up vessel. He tried to save. Really tried. But something always came up. Equipment would break and need replacing. The station would raise dock fees. He'd get sick and need medicine. It felt like the universe was conspiring to keep him grounded forever. Rick tossed the dirty rag onto his workbench and checked his account balance on his battered old tablet. 5 credits. That's all he had to his name after paying this month's rent. 5 lousy credits that wouldn't even buy him a decent meal in the station's cafeteria. He was contemplating whether to spend those credits on food or save them for next month's expenses when the workshop door slid open with a screech that meant he really needed to fix the mechanism. The visitor was Breck, a 4-armed Quilarian who ran the big salvage yard 3 docks over. Breck looked like someone had crossed a beetle with a bear and given the result too many limbs. His exoskeleton was a mottled brown color, and his compound eyes reflected the workshop's harsh lighting in weird ways. But he was decent enough, as alien salvage dealers went. He'd never tried to cheat Rick too badly, and he always paid what he owed. "Hey, human." Breck called out, his voice coming through the translator box attached to his thorax. The device made him sound like a gravelly-voiced old man, which didn't match his appearance at all. "You still looking for a ship?" Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the laugh of someone who'd heard the same joke too many times. "With what money, Breck?" "Look at my account balance. I've got 5 credits total. That wouldn't even buy me a seat on a ship, much less an actual vessel." Breck's mandibles clicked together in what might have been a Quilarian smile. "Hard to tell with their species. 5 credits, you say? Perfect. That's exactly what I need." Rick set down the power converter he'd been pretending to work on and gave Breck his full attention. "What are you talking about?" "I got a ship in my yard," Breck said, gesturing with 2 of his 4 arms toward the general direction of his salvage operation. "Been sitting there for decades, maybe longer. I inherited it from the previous owner of the yard, and he probably inherited it from whoever ran the place before him. Nobody knows how old it really is." "Okay," Rick said slowly, not sure where this was going. "Why are you telling me?" "Because nobody wants it. It's old, really old, older than anything else in my yard. The design is weird, doesn't match any current specifications. Parts for it don't exist anymore, and the systems are completely dead. No power, no life support, nothing. It's just taking up valuable space." Breck's mandibles clicked again. "Give me 5 credits and it's yours. I just want it gone." Rick stared at the alien, trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate joke. You're offering to sell me a ship for 5 credits? The same amount as a cheap meal. That's right. The hull's intact, mostly. It's space-worthy in the sense that it won't immediately fall apart. But everything else is dead. Maybe you can fix it with all those clever human hands of yours. Maybe you just strip it for parts. Either way, I get my space back, and you get whatever you can make of it. Breck shifted his weight, and his exoskeleton made a faint creaking sound. I'm not going to pretend it's a good ship, human. It's a wreck. But it's a wreck you can afford. Rick felt his heart start to beat faster. This was either the best opportunity of his life or the stupidest decision he could possibly make. Probably both. Can I see it first? He asked. Sure. Come on. Rick grabbed his tool bag out of habit and followed Breck through the station's corridors toward the salvage yard. Kepler 9 was a maze of passages that all looked the same, with flickering lights and walls covered in alien graffiti and rust stains. They passed a few other beings along the way. A Chitauri merchant hauling cargo, a human couple arguing about something in rapid Spanish, a floating jellyfish-looking alien that Rick had never figured out the name of. Breck's salvage yard was basically a series of connected hangars full of dead ships, broken equipment, and stripped hulls. The Quilarian led Rick through 2 hangars packed with the usual junk before stopping in front of a vessel that sat in the back corner, covered in dust and looking like it hadn't been touched in years. The ship was small, maybe a light freighter or personal transport. The hull was dented and scarred, with paint so faded that Rick couldn't tell what color it had originally been. Several hull plates were missing, showing the structural framework underneath. The landing gear was bent at an angle that looked wrong. And the whole thing had an aura of abandonment, like it had given up on ever flying again. This is it, Breck announced. Beautiful, isn't it? That's one word for it, Rick muttered. He walked around the vessel, his mechanic's eye automatically cataloging the problems. The list was long. Very long. But the hull did look intact, and the framework seemed solid enough. If the internal systems weren't completely rusted through, maybe, just maybe, he could do something with it. Can I go inside? Rick asked. Be my guest. Airlock should still work mechanically, even if the electronics are dead. Rick climbed up the bent landing gear, which groaned under his weight but held. The outer airlock door was stuck, but he managed to force it open with some creative leverage using a pry bar from his tool bag. The inner door opened more easily, and Rick stepped into the ship for the first time. The interior was dark, with only the light from his handheld flashlight cutting through the gloom. But as his eyes adjusted, Rick felt a flutter of surprise in his chest. The inside was in much better shape than the outside suggested. There was dust everywhere, and the air was stale, but the structure looked sound. No major damage, no obvious holes or breaks. The corridor led to what looked like a small cargo bay, with side passages that probably went to crew quarters and engineering. But what really caught Rick's attention was the design. It was strange, not matching any alien species he was familiar with. The proportions felt wrong for most aliens, but they were oddly right for humans. The doorways were human height. The corridor was human width. Even the handholds and control panels were positioned where a human would naturally reach for them. That was weird. Really weird. Most alien ships were a nightmare for humans to operate because they were built for different body types, different arm lengths, different heights. But this ship felt almost comfortable, like it had been designed with humans in mind. Rick made his way forward to the cockpit, which was small but functional. 2 seats, side by side, both covered in dust. A control panel that looked ancient but not incomprehensible. And a large viewport that would give a good view of space once it was cleaned. He started examining the systems more carefully, looking for serial numbers or manufacturer stamps or anything that would tell him who had built this vessel. But there was nothing. No identifying marks anywhere. Just an old ship with a design that didn't match anything in his database. Rick was about to head back to check the engineering section when his boot caught on something. He looked down and saw that the captain's chair was bolted to the floor at a weird angle, like it had shifted over time and someone had just secured it where it ended up instead of fixing it properly. He knelt down to examine the bolts and realized they were loose. Probably from decades of vibration and neglect. On a whim, he tried to straighten the chair, pulling it back toward its original position. There was a click. A mechanical sound, not electronic, that came from behind the chair. Rick froze. He aimed his flashlight at the back of the chair and saw that a small panel had popped open, revealing a compartment he hadn't known existed. Inside the compartment was a data core, about the size of a thick book, made from some kind of dark metal. And it was glowing. Faintly, but definitely glowing with a soft blue light. Rick's hands trembled as he reached for it. The data core was warm to the touch and surprisingly heavy. It shouldn't still have power. Nothing on this ship had power. But somehow, this thing was active, running on some kind of battery or power source that had survived however many decades this ship had been sitting abandoned. He pulled his diagnostic tablet out of his tool bag and found a cable that looked like it might fit the data core's port. It took 3 tries, but he finally got a connection. His tablet screen flickered, and then data started flowing. Star charts appeared first. But not alien star charts. Human ones. With Earth at the center, showing the familiar constellations and nearby systems that every human kid learned about in school. Rick's breath caught in his throat. This was a human ship. Or at least a ship that had been made for humans. But why was it sitting in a Quilarian salvage yard thousands of light years from Earth? How long had it been here? He kept scrolling through the data, and then he saw something that made his heart stop. Coordinates. Specific coordinates for a location deep in unexplored space. And next to those coordinates was a label that made Rick's blood run cold. New Terra, Emergency Evacuation Site, 2187. Rick stared at the words, his mind racing. New Terra. He'd heard that name before, years ago, in a history class he'd barely paid attention to. It was one of the lost colonies, one of the early human settlements that had gone silent during the chaotic expansion period 2 centuries ago. Most people assumed everyone on New Terra had died, victims of equipment failure or disease or hostile aliens or just bad luck. But this ship had coordinates for it. Specific, detailed coordinates, marked as an emergency evacuation site. What if New Terra wasn't dead? What if the colonists had survived somehow, and they were still out there, cut off and forgotten? Rick's tablet beeped, interrupting his thoughts. The sound was automatic, a notification that the data transfer had pinged through the station's network. His diagnostic tablet was connected to Kepler-9's local network for updates and maintenance logs, and that connection meant the data from the core had briefly touched the station's servers. Rick's stomach dropped. On a frontier station like Kepler-9, full of information brokers, smugglers, and pirates, network traffic was monitored constantly. People paid good money for interesting data, and what Rick had just accessed was very, very interesting. He quickly disconnected the data core and shoved it into his tool bag. He needed to move fast. If the wrong people had noticed that data ping, they'd come looking for him. And they wouldn't be polite about asking what he'd found. Rick climbed out of the ship and found Breck waiting outside, cleaning dirt from between his exoskeleton plates with one set of arms while the other set held a data pad. "So?" the Quilarian asked. "You want it or not?" Rick pulled out his tablet and transferred his last 5 credits to Breck's account. "I'll take it." "Smart choice, human. Or possibly the dumbest thing you've ever done. Time will tell." Breck marked something on his data pad. "It's yours now. Good luck getting it running." As Rick watched the Quilarian walk away, he felt the weight of the data core in his tool bag and the weight of what he discovered pressing down on him. He owned a ship now. A broken, ancient, mysterious ship that might have belonged to Earth's lost colony. And hidden inside it were coordinates that could lead to people who'd been abandoned 2 centuries ago. Rick knew he should probably just sell the coordinates to the highest bidder, take the money, and forget about the whole thing. That would be the smart play. The safe play. But he kept thinking about those colonists on New Terra, if they were still alive. Kept thinking about how they must feel, cut off from Earth, wondering if anyone remembered them or cared that they existed. Rick made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to fix this ship, and he was going to find New Terra. Not for money. Not for fame. But because someone needed to. Because those people deserved to know they hadn't been forgotten. First, though, he needed to survive the next 24 hours. Because as Rick headed back to his workshop, he noticed people watching him. Strangers who'd never paid attention to him before, now tracking his movements with focused interest. Word had gotten out. And Rick Carter, broke mechanic with 5 credits to his name, had just become the most interesting person on Kepler-9 station. This was either going to be the best decision of his life or the one that got him killed. Possibly both. Rick didn't sleep that night. He couldn't afford to. Not when he'd noticed at least 3 different groups of people suddenly very interested in his movements. Not when his communicator had started buzzing with offers from strangers who somehow knew he'd found something valuable. And definitely not when a scarred Valerian with cold eyes had cornered him in a corridor and told him, very politely, that his new ship would be changing ownership tomorrow whether he liked it or not. The message was clear: he had maybe 24 hours before someone took the ship from him by force, bribery, or bureaucratic manipulation. Maybe all 3. The ship was a disaster, though. The power core was completely dead, just a cold lump of metal that hadn't generated energy in who knows how many decades. The navigation systems were fried beyond recognition, circuit boards burned and corroded. Half the wiring looked like something had been living in it, with insulation chewed through and connections that had corroded into useless junk. The life support was a joke. The engines were seized up. The whole vessel was basically a fancy coffin that happened to be shaped like a ship. Making this thing space-worthy in 24 hours should have been impossible. Most mechanics would have laughed at the idea and walked away. But Rick had been doing impossible repairs for 3 years on Kepler-9. Impossible was kind of his specialty. He started by calling in every favor he had, and he had a few. 3 years of fixing equipment for half the station meant people owed him. Time to collect. First call went to Lisa Martinez, his friend who worked station security. Lisa was tough as nails, a former Earth military type who'd ended up on Kepler-9 after some incident she never talked about. She'd brought Rick broken equipment plenty of times, and he'd always fixed it quickly and cheaply. Now he needed her help. "Lisa, I need you to lose some paperwork for me," Rick said over a secure comm channel. "Maybe 48 hours worth of losing it." "What kind of paperwork?" Lisa's voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "The kind that says I bought a ship today. The kind that might attract official attention from people asking official questions about what I found on that ship." There was a pause. "Rick, what did you get yourself into?" "Something big. Something I can't explain yet. But I need time to get off this station before the wrong people start asking the right questions." Another pause, longer this time. Then Lisa sighed. 48 hours. That's all I can do. After that, the system automatically flags unapproved vessel purchases for inspection. I can't stop that without leaving a trail that points back to me. 48 hours is enough. Thanks, Lisa. I owe you. Yeah, you do. And Rick? Whatever you found, be careful. I've been seeing some rough types asking about you. The kind who don't take no for an answer. Rick had noticed them too. That's why he was in such a hurry. Second call went to Tommy Wu, who ran a gray market parts operation 2 levels down from Rick's workshop. Tommy was the kind of guy who could get you anything if you didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. Probably smuggled, possibly stolen, definitely not legally obtained. But in a place like Kepler-9, legal was more of a suggestion than a rule. Rick found Tommy in his cluttered shop, surrounded by equipment that had serial numbers filed off and origins that were deliberately vague. "I need a power core," Rick said without preamble. "For a really old ship. Like ancient old." Tommy whistled low, pushing his glasses up his nose. He was a small guy, thin and wiry, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. "Ancient how? Like 50 years? 100. Try 200, maybe more. I don't even know what the original specs were. But I need something that can generate enough power to run basic systems and get me through a portal jump." Tommy pulled out a battered tablet and started scrolling through his inventory. 200 years old? Man, that's museum territory. I don't have anything that would fit original specs. He paused, then grinned. "But I do have something that might work if you're crazy enough to make it fit." "How crazy are we talking?" "I got a salvaged Vailian military power core. Pulled it from a decommissioned fighter last month. It works perfectly, generates plenty of power, but it's completely the wrong size, wrong voltage, wrong connection type. Basically incompatible with anything human-made." Rick thought about it. Incompatible meant he'd have to fabricate custom adapters, rewire the entire power distribution system, and probably violate about 17 safety regulations. But it would work if he could pull it off. "How much?" Rick asked. Tommy named a price that made Rick wince. It was more than he had by a factor of about 50. "I don't have that kind of money," Rick admitted. "But I will. Soon. I can pay you back triple what you're asking within a month." Tommy studied him for a long moment. "You're serious about whatever this is?" "Dead serious." "Fine. I'll front you the core. But if you die or disappear, I'm selling your workshop and everything in it to cover the debt." "Deal." Tommy had the power core loaded onto a hovercart within minutes, and Rick started pushing it back toward the dock where his ship sat today. The thing was heavy, easily 300 pounds, and awkward to maneuver through Kepler-9's cramped corridors. But Rick managed, ignoring the stares from passers-by who wondered why a human was hauling military hardware through the station. Back at the ship, Rick stared at the dead power core and the incompatible Vailian replacement and started planning the most insane repair job of his career. The Valerian core was cylindrical where the original was rectangular. It generated twice the voltage at half the amperage. The connection ports were on opposite sides. The mounting brackets didn't line up with anything in the ship's engineering bay. In short, nothing about it was right. Rick got to work anyway. He fabricated adapter plates from scrap metal he'd been saving, cutting and welding pieces together to create brackets that could hold the Valerian core in place. He tore out half the ship's original power distribution system and rebuilt it from scratch, using wire he salvaged from broken equipment and junction boxes he'd been hoarding for years. He built voltage converters by hand, testing each one carefully because one mistake would either blow out every system on the ship or electrocute him. Possibly both. The work was exhausting, requiring constant attention and absolute precision. One wrong connection, one miscalculation, and the whole thing would fail. Or worse, it would work just long enough to kill him when he tried to use it. Around hour 6, Rick heard someone climbing aboard the ship. He grabbed a wrench defensively, but relaxed when he saw Breck's forearm form ducking through the airlock. "Heard you got problems, human," the Quilarian said. "You could say that." Breck set down a battered toolbox that looked older than Rick's ship. "These tools fit your vessel. Found them in storage. Thought you might need them." Rick opened the box and found tools with bolt patterns he'd never seen before, designed for the ship's ancient systems. They were exactly what he needed. "Why are you helping me?" Rick asked, suspicious of generosity on a place like Kepler 9. Breck's mandibles clicked in that way that might have been a shrug. "I sold you a ship. Don't want to see you die because of it. Bad for my reputation. People might think I sell death traps." He paused. "Also, I've been hearing things. Rough types asking about you, about what you found. I don't like bullies. Never have." With Breck's help, the work went faster. The Quilarian had experience with ancient ships and could spot problems Rick would have missed. They worked side by side through the night, human and alien, fighting to resurrect a vessel that had been dead for longer than either of them had been alive. During brief rest breaks, Rick kept digging through the data core. The more he learned about New Terra, the more convinced he became that this was real. The colony had been experimental, volunteers trying to prove that humans could thrive without depending on alien technology. They'd taken cutting-edge equipment for the time and headed out to build something new. The logs showed initial success. Settlements established, crops growing, population stable. Then things started going wrong. References to indigenous life that turned out to be intelligent. Attempts at communication that didn't go well. Growing tension. The colony ship taking damage in an incident the logs didn't fully explain. The final entry was dated 2189, just 2 years after arrival, situation deteriorating rapidly. Colony ship damaged beyond our ability to repair. We're cut off from Earth. Requesting immediate support. If anyone receives this transmission, please help us. Don't let them forget about us. Nobody had helped. Earth had been dealing with its own problems, and one experimental colony had been forgotten in the chaos. Rick felt anger building in his chest. Those people had been abandoned. Left to die alone. And for 200 years, nobody had cared enough to check if they'd survived. He went back to work with renewed determination. Hour 12, power core installed and secured with the custom brackets. Rick held his breath and activated it for the first time. The ship groaned, lights flickered weakly, and then steady power began flowing through the rebuilt systems. It worked. It actually worked. Hour 16, navigation systems barely functional but online. Rick uploaded the coordinates from the data core, and the ancient computer accepted them, plotting a course through a series of portal jumps. The route was long, dangerous, and passed through some seriously remote systems. But it was doable. Hour 20, life support activated. The air that started flowing through the vents tasted stale and metallic, but it was breathable. Temperature controls were erratic, swinging between too hot and too cold, but Rick could fix that later. Maybe. If he survived. Hour 22, Rick was running final diagnostics on the thrusters when Lisa burst through the airlock, breathing hard and looking panicked. "Rick, you need to go. Right now. There's a group heading this way, and they're armed. They're not station security, they're not official, and they're definitely not here to ask nicely." Rick looked at his half-repaired ship. It wasn't ready. The navigation was glitchy, the weapons systems were completely dead, and there were hull patches that were basically just prayers and duct tape. Flying this thing now was suicidal. But staying was definitely fatal. "Breck, you need to leave," Rick said urgently. The Quilarian was already heading for the airlock. "Good luck, human." Try not to die immediately. I'll do my best. Lisa grabbed Rick's arm. I can buy you maybe 2 minutes by routing them the wrong way. But after that, you're on your own. 2 minutes is enough. Thank you, Lisa. For everything. She squeezed his arm once, then ran back toward the station proper, already shouting into her communicator about a false alarm on a different level. Rick sealed the airlock and ran for the pilot seat. His hands flew over controls he barely understood, activating systems in the sequence he'd memorized during his repairs. The ship's engines coughed to life like a sick animal waking from hibernation, making sounds that no healthy engine should ever make. Through the viewport, Rick saw figures in combat armor forcing their way through the docking area security checkpoint. They weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. Rick didn't have time for a proper launch sequence. He just grabbed the controls and fired every thruster at maximum power. The ship lurched forward violently, tearing free from the docking clamps with a screech of metal that made Rick's teeth hurt. Alarms immediately started blaring across every console, warning him about structural stress, unauthorized departure, and about 50 other problems he didn't have time to address. The station's automated defense system locked onto him as an unauthorized launch, and Rick saw weapons turrets tracking his movement. Apparently Lisa could only delay so much. Rick threw the ship into a desperate dive through Kepler-9's superstructure, using cargo containers and docked ships as cover. The ancient vessel handled like a drunk elephant, sluggish and unpredictable, but it was responding to his commands. Barely. Behind him, the pirate ship launched in pursuit, and Rick saw energy weapons starting to charge. They weren't even pretending this was legal anymore. Station defense started firing, but Rick couldn't tell if they were shooting at him or at the pirates. Maybe both. He dodged left, then right, then down, navigating through the maze of docks and platforms by pure instinct. A cargo hauler pulled directly into his path, blocking his route to the portal gate. Rick didn't have time to stop. He banked so hard that the artificial gravity failed for a second, and he felt himself lift out of the seat before the restraints caught him. Something in the aft section exploded with a sound like a gunshot, but Rick didn't have time to check what. The portal gate was ahead, glowing with the swirling energy of an active connection. Behind him, the pirates were gaining, and station security was still shooting. Rick had maybe 5 seconds before someone got a solid hit or the station locked down the portal entirely. He didn't check his calculations. Didn't verify the course. Didn't even think about it. Rick just punched in the first set of coordinates from the data core and slammed the jump activation. The ship hit the portal at full speed. Reality twisted. Space bent in ways that made Rick's stomach try to climb out through his throat. Every warning light on the console lit up at once. The engine screamed. The hull groaned. For one terrible moment, Rick was absolutely convinced the ancient ship was going to tear itself apart. Then they were through, emerging in an empty system light years from Kepler-9. No pirates. No station security. No immediate threats. Just Rick, his half-broken ship, and silence. Rick looked at the damage report scrolling across his screen and groaned. The jump had cost him. Power was down to 60%. Navigation was glitching worse than before. Something in life support was making a clicking sound that definitely wasn't normal. And there was a hull breach warning for a section he didn't even know existed. But he'd made it. Against all odds, he'd actually escaped. Rick pulled up the navigation plot and looked at the route ahead. Weeks of jumps through increasingly remote systems, each one farther from civilization. All leading to coordinates that might point to a colony that might still exist. He thought about turning back. About selling the coordinates to someone else and letting them take the risk. But then he remembered that final log entry. Those desperate colonists calling for help that never came. Okay, New Terra, Rick said to the empty cockpit. Let's see if you're really out there. The ship groaned in response, and Rick decided to take that as encouragement. He'd come this far. Might as well finish what he'd started. Time to find Earth's lost colony. Or die trying. Probably both. 3 weeks. That's how long the navigation computer said it would take to reach New Terra's coordinates, assuming Rick could keep the ship functional that long. 3 weeks of jumping through a series of increasingly remote portal gates, each one farther from civilized space than the last. 3 weeks passing through systems that most pilots avoided because there was nothing out there except empty space and the occasional asteroid field. 3 weeks alone in a ship that was actively trying to fall apart around him. Rick quickly established a routine out of sheer necessity. Wake up to some new alarm blaring, stumble out of his bunk, and fix whatever had broken overnight. Eat something from his dwindling supply of ration bars that barely qualified as food and tasted like cardboard mixed with sadness. Check the navigation plot and calculate the next jump. Fix something else that had just started making a concerning noise. Try to sleep for a few hours in a cabin where the temperature swung wildly between freezing and sauna-like. Then wake up and do it all over again. The ancient ship required constant attention, like a sick patient that refused to get better no matter what medicine you gave it. Day 3 brought the first major crisis. Rick woke up to find his cabin completely soaked, water dripping from the ceiling and pooling on the floor. For a terrifying moment, he thought there was a hull breach, but then he realized it was condensation from the life support system. Something in the environmental controls had failed overnight, and moisture was building up instead of being properly recycled. He spent 6 brutal hours tracing the problem through a maze of pipes that ran behind panels he had to cut open because the access hatches had been welded shut decades ago by someone who clearly didn't care about future repairs. The pipes themselves were corroded, covered in mineral deposits and who knows what else that had built up over the years. When Rick finally found the leak, a hairline crack in a joint that was letting pressure bleed off, he had to fabricate a seal from spare parts because he didn't have the right replacement components. By the time he finished, his tools were starting to rust from the moisture, and Rick himself was exhausted and soaked through. But the leak was fixed, and air started circulating properly again. Day 5 brought a different problem. The power core that Tommy had sold him started fluctuating randomly, surging and dropping without warning. Lights would flare bright enough to hurt Rick's eyes, then dim to almost nothing, leaving him in near darkness. The artificial gravity, which had never been great, would cut out for seconds at a time. Rick would find himself floating helplessly in the middle of whatever he was doing, then slam back down when gravity suddenly reconnected. It was like being on a roller coaster designed by someone who hated people. Rick had to recalibrate the Vailian power core 3 separate times, adjusting the voltage converters he'd built by hand and praying that he got the numbers right. Too much power and he'd fry every system on the ship. Too little and life support would fail. He walked a razor's edge between catastrophe and slightly less catastrophe. Even after the adjustments, the power wasn't perfect. But it was stable enough to keep him alive, and that was all Rick could ask for. Day 8 nearly killed him. He was in the middle of a portal jump when the navigation computer just rebooted without warning. 1 second Rick was monitoring the jump sequence, the next his screens went black and the ship was tumbling through portal space with no guidance whatsoever. 4:30 terrifying seconds that felt like hours. Rick had absolutely no idea where he was, which direction he was traveling, or if he was about to emerge inside a star or a planet or just get stuck in portal space forever. His hands flew over the controls, trying to manually stabilize the ship while the computer went through its startup sequence with maddening slowness. When the navigation finally came back online, Rick discovered he'd missed his intended exit portal by 2 jumps. He was in completely the wrong system, and he had to backtrack, wasting fuel and time he couldn't afford to lose. After that incident, Rick started saving backup copies of his navigation data every hour, storing it in 3 different locations in case the computer decided to have another episode. But between the constant repairs and the stress and the exhaustion, Rick kept studying the data core. He couldn't help himself. The mystery of new terror consumed him during the long hours between crises. The more he learned, the more the colony fascinated him. These hadn't been ordinary settlers looking for a new home. They'd been idealists with a mission. The logs talked about building a civilization that didn't depend on alien goodwill or alien technology. They wanted to prove that humans could stand on their own in the galaxy, could create something lasting using human ingenuity and determination. The colonists had been volunteers, all of them. People willing to give up everything they knew, travel farther than any human had gone before, and build something new from nothing. Scientists, engineers, farmers, teachers, doctors. 2,000 people who believed in something bigger than themselves. Rick found himself admiring them. These were people who'd refused to take the easy path, who'd chosen challenge over comfort. The ship's logs revealed more about what they'd called indigenous complications. New Terra's planet wasn't uninhabited like the original surveys had suggested. There was native life, and some of it was intelligent. The colonists had thought they were settling an empty world, but they'd been catastrophically wrong. The natives were described as crystalline beings that lived in extensive cave systems beneath the planet's surface. The early log entries showed confusion and concern as the colonists realized they weren't alone. Then came attempts at communication, efforts to establish peaceful contact. But something had gone wrong. The logs became more worried, more urgent. There were references to misunderstandings and unfortunate incidents that weren't fully explained. The colony ship had taken damage, though the logs didn't specify how or why. Relationships with the natives were deteriorating rapidly. Then the logs just stopped. The last entry, dated 2189, was that desperate call for help that nobody had answered. Rick spent hours trying to imagine what had happened next. Had there been a war between the colonists and the natives? Had the humans been wiped out? Or had they somehow found a way to make peace, to survive despite everything? He wouldn't know until he arrived. If he arrived. On day 12, Rick's isolation was broken by a signal that made his blood run cold. His sensor board lit up with a contact, faint but definite, tracking him through the portal network. Someone was following him. Rick tried to identify the signal, but it was encrypted and jamming his attempts to get a clear reading. He couldn't tell if it was the pirates from Kepler 9, or corporate hunters, or someone else entirely. But whoever they were good. They'd managed to follow his route through a dozen jumps across half the galaxy. And they were closing the distance. Rick pushed the ship harder, jumping through portals faster than was safe, taking routes that bypassed the main network and used older, less stable gates. Each jump put more strain on his already overstressed systems. The engines ran hotter than they should. The power core fluctuated more wildly. Hull plates started vibrating in ways that suggested they might just decide to fall off entirely. But Rick kept pushing, because stopping meant getting caught, and getting caught meant losing everything. The ship following him matched his pace. They were determined, and they had better equipment than Rick's ancient vessel. He was running, and they were hunting, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. On day 16, desperate and running out of options, Rick made a gamble that could have killed him. He'd reached a junction point where 3 different portal routes intersected. One of those portals was flagged in his database with warning markers. Unstable, use at own risk, frequent collapses. Most pilots avoided it entirely because jumping through an unstable portal was a good way to get torn apart by gravitational shears. Rick didn't have the luxury of playing it safe. He aimed his ship at the unstable portal and jumped before he could talk himself out of it. The moment he entered portal space, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The ship shuddered so violently that Rick thought it would literally shake itself to pieces. Alarms screamed across every console. Something in the aft section exploded with a bang that echoed through the hull. The viewport showed portal space flickering and distorting in ways it shouldn't, reality bending wrong. Rick gripped the controls so hard his knuckles went white, fighting to keep the ship stable while forces tried to tear it in every direction at once. Metal groaned. Circuits sparked. And Rick prayed to whatever might be listening that the hull would hold together just a little bit longer. When he finally emerged on the other side, Rick immediately checked his sensors for the pursuing signal. It was gone. Either his hunters hadn't been crazy enough to follow through an unstable portal, or they'd tried and hadn't made it through. Rick didn't know which, and frankly he didn't care. He was just grateful to be alone again. The ship was in rough shape after that jump. Rick spent the next 2 days making emergency repairs, patching systems that had been damaged by the violent transition. But he was alive, and he bought himself some breathing room. On day 19, exhausted and running on stimulants and stubbornness, Rick picked up a new signal. This one wasn't behind him. It was ahead, coming from New Terra's coordinates. His hands were shaking as he worked to decrypt it. The signal was old, using a broadcast format that predated modern communication standards by decades. It took Rick 3 hours of trial and error, cross-referencing ancient protocols in his database and making educated guesses, before he finally cracked the encryption. When he heard the message, tears started running down his face before he even realized he was crying. New Terra calling any Earth ships. We survived. We're still here. Please respond. Please come home. We haven't forgotten you. Please don't forget us. The message was dated 3 years ago, 2381. Recent, in the grand scheme of things. New Terra was real. The colonists had survived 200 years of isolation. They were still alive, still calling out into the void, still hoping that someone from Earth would hear them and care enough to respond. Rick sat in his pilot's chair, staring at the coordinates that were now only a few days away, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd discovered. Somewhere out there, cut off from the rest of humanity for 2 centuries, were people who'd never stopped believing that Earth would come back for them. Who'd built a civilization in the darkness, who'd survived impossible odds, who'd kept hope alive when every rational reason said they should give up. And Rick was going to be the first person from Earth to find them in 200 years. He plotted the final series of jumps, triple-checked his calculations, and pushed forward. His ship was barely holding together, held in place by repairs on top of repairs on top of jury-rigged fixes. But it just had to last a few more days. Almost there, Rick told the empty cockpit, his voice hoarse from disuse. Just a little farther. You can make it. The engines hummed in response, and Rick chose to believe the ship understood. 3 days later, Rick activated the final portal jump. When he emerged, he saw something that took his breath away. A planet hung in space ahead of him, beautiful and alive. Blue oceans. Green continents. White clouds swirling across a world that looked almost like Earth but wasn't. New Terra. And orbiting around it, impossible but undeniable, were satellites. Space stations. What looked like defensive platforms and communication arrays. This wasn't a struggling colony barely surviving. This was a thriving civilization. Rick's communication board exploded with activity, multiple hails coming in at once. Then one voice cut through the chaos, speaking clear English with an accent Rick couldn't place. Unknown vessel, identify yourself immediately. This is New Terra Defense Command. You are entering sovereign space. State your origin and purpose. Rick grabbed his microphone with shaking hands. His voice cracked when he spoke. This is Rick Carter, civilian vessel from Earth. I found your coordinates in an old ship. I came to find you. There was a long pause. Rick could hear people arguing in the background, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. Then the voice came back, and it was shaking with emotion. You're from Earth? From actual Earth? From the home world? Yes, sir. Born in Houston, Texas. Another pause. Then, quietly, almost reverently, Texas still exists. Last I checked, yeah. Oh my God. The voice broke. Permission to approach granted. We're transmitting landing coordinates now. Welcome home, son. Welcome home. You have no idea how long we've been waiting. Rick guided his battered ship toward the planet, toward the impossible colony that had survived against all odds, and finally let himself believe. He'd done it. He'd found them. Earth's lost children were waiting. And they'd never stopped hoping someone would come. Rick's ship descended through New Terra's atmosphere, and every meter closer made his breath catch in his throat. The planet was stunning in a way that reminded him of Earth but with differences that made it clear this was somewhere else entirely. The oceans were a shade greener than Earth's blue, almost teal in some places where the light hit just right. The clouds had a faint purple tint to them, like someone had mixed lavender into white paint. The continents had shapes that no Earth landmass matched, strange coastlines and mountain ranges that followed patterns Rick's brain couldn't quite process. But it was clearly a living world, thriving and inhabited and beautiful. The landing coordinates they transmitted took Rick to a spaceport on the edge of what looked like a major city. As his ship got closer, Rick could see that the spaceport had been built piecemeal over what must have been decades, maybe longer. There were sections in different architectural styles that showed the colony's evolution over time. Some buildings looked almost Earth standard, the kind of prefab structures that early colonists would have brought with them. Others were made from local materials Rick didn't recognize, stone that gleamed with crystalline inclusions and metal that had a weird bronze-purple color. Ships sat on various landing pads, and they were just as varied as the buildings. Some were clearly ancient vessels, probably original colony ships or early locally built craft, patched and repaired so many times they looked like quilts made of metal. Others were newer designs that incorporated technology Rick had never seen before, sleek hulls with engine configurations that didn't match anything in his database. As Rick's battered ship touched down with a groan and a thump that suggested his landing gear was about 2 repairs away from catastrophic failure, he saw crowds gathering beyond the security barriers. Hundreds of people, all human, pressing forward to see the ship that had come from Earth. From actual Earth, the home world that most of them had only heard about in stories passed down through generations. Rick sat in the pilot's seat for a moment, suddenly overwhelmed. His hands were shaking, and he realized he was terrified. What if they were disappointed? What if they'd been expecting some official Earth vessel, not a broke mechanic in a ship held together with spare parts and stubbornness? But he'd come this far. No point backing out now. Rick opened the airlock and stepped out onto New Terra soil for the first time. The gravity was immediately noticeable, slightly lighter than Earth standard. Not enough to make him feel like he was bouncing around, but enough that his steps felt just a bit easier than they should. The air smelled different too, with a faint mineral tang he couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, just foreign. But the sun was warm on his face, and the sky was blue above him, and the people staring at him were definitely human in all the ways that mattered. The crowd had gone silent when he emerged, thousands of eyes focused on this stranger from Earth. Rick felt incredibly self-conscious, aware of how dirty his clothes were, how he probably smelled after 3 weeks in a malfunctioning ship, how his hair was sticking up in weird directions. Then an older woman pushed through the crowd, flanked by security personnel in uniforms that looked both official and homemade. She was maybe 60, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had the look of someone who'd seen too much but refused to give up. She was smiling though, really smiling, in a way that transformed her whole face and made her look decades younger. "Mr. Carter," she called out as she approached. "I'm Governor Patricia Walsh. Welcome to New Terra." She extended her hand, and Rick shook it automatically. Her grip was firm, and he could feel calluses that marked someone who'd done real physical work in her life, not just administrative desk duty. "Welcome," she repeated, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You have absolutely no idea how long we've been waiting for this moment." Rick's throat felt tight. "How did you survive?" The question burst out of him before he could think of something more diplomatic to say. "The logs I found said you had problems with the natives, the colony ship was damaged, you were requesting support. What happened? How are you still here?" Governor Walsh's smile faded a little, becoming something more complex. Sad but also proud. "It's a very long story, Mr. Carter. Come with me. I'll show you what we've built here, and I'll explain everything. I think you'll find it's quite a tale." Over the next several hours, Rick got a whirlwind tour of New Terra's capital city, which they'd named Hope Station. The name felt appropriate. The place was a fascinating blend of Earth and alien, human ingenuity and local adaptation. Buildings made from both imported materials and native stone sat side by side. Technology that was sometimes more advanced than Earth standard in weird, unexpected ways existed next to more primitive solutions born from necessity and limited resources. Governor Walsh explained as they walked. "We started with 2,000 colonists in 2187. We're now at nearly 50,000 spread across 3 continents. We've established settlements in different climate zones, learned to work with the local environment instead of against it. They passed through markets where people sold food Rick didn't recognize alongside vegetables that looked almost Earth normal. Workshops where craftspeople created everything from tools to art. Schools where children who'd never seen Earth learned about the home world their ancestors had left behind. We've had to be innovative," Walsh continued. "When the colony ship was damaged and we lost contact with Earth, we lost access to replacement parts, new equipment, outside knowledge. Everything we have, we've had to maintain, repair, or build ourselves. It's made us very good at improvisation." Rick could see that in everything around him. The way people had adapted Earth technology to work with local materials. The hybrid designs that mixed multiple approaches to solve problems. It reminded him of his own workshop on Kepler 9, where he'd learned to fix anything with whatever he had available. But the most surprising thing came when Governor Walsh led him down, beneath Hope Station, into the extensive cave systems that riddled the planet's crust. "Mr. Carter," Walsh said as they descended on a lift that looked like it had been built and rebuilt a dozen times, "I need to introduce you to our neighbors." The caves were massive, lit by bioluminescent growths that gave everything a soft blue-green glow. The stone walls weren't just rock, they were crystalline, facete surfaces that reflected and refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. And moving through those caves were beings that took Rick's breath away. They looked like living sculptures made from gemstone. Each one was unique, some tall and thin, others compact and solid, all of them covered in crystalline formations that ranged in color from clear to deep purple to brilliant gold. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for beings made of what looked like solid crystal. As they moved, they made sounds, musical chiming notes that resonated through the caves. "These are the Resh," Walsh explained. "The indigenous species. The complications mentioned in those old logs." One of the beings approached them, and Rick instinctively took a step back. Up close, he could see that its body was incredibly complex, layers of crystal formations that grew and changed, refracting light in patterns that hurt his eyes if he looked too directly. A device in Walsh's hand translated the musical chiming into words. "You are from the original homeworld?" the Resh asked, and even through the translator Rick could hear curiosity in its tone. "Yes," Rick managed to say. "From Earth." The Resh's body flashed with colors, and the translator interpreted it. The Resh are deeply honored to meet one who traveled so far. Humans are a strange species, but we have learned they are honorable. They chose peace when war would have been the easier path. Rick looked at Governor Walsh for explanation. She gestured for them to follow as they walked deeper into the caves, where Rick could see humans and Resh working side by side on what looked like some kind of mining or excavation operation. "The first decade was hell," Walsh said quietly. "The Resh live primarily underground in these cave systems. We didn't even know they were here at first because our surface surveys missed them. When we started building, we accidentally damaged some of their settlements. They retaliated by sabotaging our equipment. We fought back. People died on both sides, human and Resh both. She paused, her expression heavy with old grief. The colony ship was damaged in one of those early conflicts. We lost our ability to leave, to call for help, to do anything except survive with what we had. And for a while, it looked like we'd destroy each other completely. What changed? Rick asked. Necessity, Walsh said simply. And exhaustion. And finally, communication. We realized that if we wanted to survive, we had to coexist. Fighting would just kill us all, and neither species wanted that. So we learned their language, they learned ours. We negotiated borders, resource sharing, peaceful coexistence. The Resh who'd been following them chimed in, its translator converting the sounds. Humans are adaptable. They learn. They compromise. At first, the Resh thought humans were invaders who would take everything. But humans showed us they could share. That cooperation benefits all. Walsh smiled at the Resh fondly. It wasn't easy. It took decades. But we built something together. A civilization where two species share one world, working together instead of destroying each other. It's messy sometimes, and we still have disagreements, but it works. Rick felt something swelling in his chest. Pride, maybe. These people had done something incredible. They'd been abandoned, cut off, facing disaster, and they'd chosen the harder path. The human path. They'd adapted, cooperated, survived through sheer determination and willingness to try something new. But as they returned to the surface and entered Governor Walsh's office, her expression turned serious. Mr. Carter, we have a major problem, she said, pulling up a holographic display. This is our portal gate, the only one in this system. It's the only connection we have to the rest of the galaxy. Rick studied the display and felt his stomach drop. The gate's power systems were degrading badly, crystal matrices that should have been stable were fracturing, and the whole structure looked like it was on the verge of catastrophic failure. It's been failing for 3 years, Walsh explained. We've tried everything we can think of to repair it, using the technical data from our colony ship and every innovation we've developed. But we're missing critical components. Parts we can't manufacture with our industrial capacity. Materials that don't exist in this system. She pulled up a detailed schematic showing what they needed. Rick recognized some of it: high-grade superconductors, quantum-entangled crystal matrices, exotic elements that required specific stellar conditions to form. If the gate collapses completely, which our best estimates say will happen in about 6 months, we'll be cut off forever, Walsh said, and Rick could hear the fear underneath her controlled tone. No ships in or out. No communication. Complete isolation. We've survived 200 years of being cut off from Earth, but at least we had the hope that someone might find us someday. If the gate fails, that hope dies. She looked at Rick with desperate intensity. We sent that distress signal 3 years ago, broadcasting constantly, hoping someone would hear it. You're the first person to respond. The first person to even find us. Her voice cracked slightly. Can you get back to Earth? Can you bring help before our gate fails completely? Rick thought about his ship, which had barely survived the journey here and was held together by repairs that wouldn't last much longer. He thought about the pirates and corporate hunters who were probably still searching for him. He thought about the fact that he was one broke mechanic with no authority, no connections, no real influence with anyone who mattered. But he also thought about 50,000 people who'd survived 2 centuries through cooperation and determination. People who'd built something incredible against impossible odds. People who deserved to rejoin the human family they'd never abandoned, even when everyone else had forgotten them. And he thought about the Resh, an entire alien species who'd learned to share their world with humans, who'd chosen peace over war. They deserved better than to be forgotten again. I'll try, Rick said, meeting Walsh's eyes. I'll do everything I can. Walsh's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. We'll give you everything we can to help. Our best engineers will repair your ship, properly this time. We'll provide complete documentation of our history, proof of our existence, technical specifications for what we need. Video messages from our people. Everything. She paused, then added, and I'm sending people with you. A crew who can speak for New Terra, who can prove we're real and that we've thrived. You won't have to do this alone. Over the next week, Rick's ship was completely transformed. New Terran engineers swarmed over it, and Rick learned just how innovative 2 centuries of isolation had made these people. They replaced his dying systems with locally manufactured equivalents that were actually better than the originals in surprising ways. They'd had to innovate, to solve problems without access to standard parts or outside knowledge, and it showed. The crew Governor Walsh assigned him consisted of 3 humans and 1 Resh, all volunteers who understood the risks. Beth Harper was an engineer in her 30s, tough and competent, who could look at any system and immediately understand how to fix it or improve it. She'd been maintaining spacecraft since she was a teenager. Mike Rodriguez was a pilot with decades of experience flying in New Terra's sometimes unpredictable weather patterns. He was quiet but confident, the kind of person you wanted at the controls when things went wrong. Amy Walsh was the governor's daughter, a trained diplomat in her 20s who'd spent years negotiating with the Resh and mediating disputes between human settlements. She was sharp, articulate, and completely committed to saving her home. And then there was the Resh named Glimmer of Dawnlight, though it asked to be called Glimmer because human tongues couldn't properly reproduce Resh names. Glimmer's body was a beautiful pale blue, and it had insisted on coming despite the risks. Your species chose cooperation over domination, Glimmer said through its translator, its body flashing with colors that conveyed earnest determination. This message must reach others in the galaxy. The Resh will help carry it. We will show them what humans and Resh built together. On the day they were scheduled to leave, it seemed like the entire city turned out to see them off. Thousands of people lined the spaceport perimeter, and Rick stood in front of his newly repaired ship feeling the enormous weight of responsibility. Governor Walsh handed him a day to drive, and her hands were shaking. Everything we are. Everything we've built. Everything we've learned in 200 years of isolation. It's all here. Take it back to Earth. Show them we survived. Show them we thrived. Her voice cracked. And please, Mr. Carter. Please bring them back to us. Bring our family home. Rick took the drive, feeling its weight like it was made of lead instead of plastic and circuits. I will. One way or another, I promise I'll bring help. As the ship lifted off, carrying its crew and its precious cargo of hope and history, Rick looked back at New Terra shrinking behind them. 50,000 people. 2 species who'd learned to live together. An impossible civilization that had survived and thrived when every rational prediction said they should have died. Now their fate rested on Rick's shoulders. The journey back was going to be harder than the journey out. There would be people hunting them. Obstacles to overcome. 1,000 things that could go wrong. But Rick had learned something important during his time on New Terra. Sometimes the most human thing you could do was refuse to give up, no matter how impossible the odds looked. Keep trying. Keep adapting. Keep fighting for what mattered. Time to prove it. Time to bring Earth's lost children home. The journey back started well. Rick's repaired ship handled better than it ever had, responding to controls with a smoothness that made him realize just how broken and jury-rigged everything had been before. The engines hummed instead of screaming. The power systems ran steady instead of fluctuating wildly. Even the artificial gravity stayed consistent, no more random moments of weightlessness followed by painful crashes back to the deck. Beth's engineering was keeping everything running perfectly, monitoring systems constantly and making tiny adjustments before problems could develop. Mike's piloting skills meant they were making significantly better time than Rick had managed on the way out, taking efficient routes and executing smooth portal jumps that didn't stress the ship's systems. For 3 glorious days, Rick actually let himself relax slightly. Maybe this would work. Maybe they'd make it back to civilized space, get the word out about New Terra, and bring help before the portal gate failed. Then, on the 3rd day, they picked up the hunters again. Rick was in the cockpit reviewing the next series of jumps when the sensor board lit up like a warning beacon. Multiple contacts, closing fast from different vectors. We've got company, Mike said tersely from the pilot's seat. Multiple ships. At least 4 different groups based on their signature patterns. Beth rushed to the cockpit, pulling up detailed scans on a secondary screen. Her face went pale as she analyzed the data. Pirates. Those are definitely the same energy signatures from the ships that chased you off Kepler 9. And there's corporate security vessels, 3 of them, flying in formation. Plus. She zoomed in on one contact. That's a Valian military frigate. What the hell is the Valian military doing out here? Amy joined them, with Glimmer right behind her. The Resh's crystalline body was flashing amber and red, colors that the translator interpreted as alarm and anger. The Valorians are broadcasting on all frequencies, Amy said, pulling up the message. They're claiming New Terra is within Valian territorial space and therefore subject to Valian law. They're ordering us to heave to and prepare for boarding. That's insane, Rick said. New Terra is nowhere near Valian space. They're just making stuff up. Doesn't matter if it's true, Mike pointed out grimly. They've got a military frigate and we've got a patched-together civilian vessel. If they want to board us, we can't stop them. Beth was still studying the sensor data, her expression getting darker by the second. They marked the route. That's the only explanation. Every jump we make, they know exactly where we're going next. Someone put trackers or data tags along the portal network, marking your original path to New Terra. Now they're using those markers to predict our jumps. Can we lose them? Rick asked, already suspecting the answer. We can try, Mike said, his hands already moving over the navigation controls. But they've got faster ships, better sensors, and more resources. And if they've marked the route, they'll know every obvious alternate path too. Then we take paths that aren't obvious, Beth said. Old routes, unstable portals, anything that most pilots avoid. What followed was 3 weeks of the most intense cat-and-mouse chase Rick had ever experienced. Every portal jump brought new complications, new threats, new groups trying to intercept them. The pirates were the most aggressive. They didn't care about legality or jurisdiction, they just wanted to capture Rick's ship and sell whatever they found inside to the highest bidder. Twice they managed to get close enough to launch boarding pods, magnetic latching vessels designed to attach to hulls and cut through airlocks. Both times Mike's piloting and Beth's creative use of the ship's systems managed to shake them off, but it was close. Too close. The corporate vessels were more subtle but just as dangerous. They tried to box Rick's ship in during portal transitions, forcing them into systems where corporate security could legally detain them for safety inspections. Amy spent hours on the communication channels, using every diplomatic trick she'd learned negotiating with the Resh to talk their way out of traps. And the Valerian military frigate just kept following, maintaining distance but never letting them escape completely. It was like they were herding Rick's ship somewhere, though Rick couldn't figure out where or why. They want us to get desperate, Amy said during a brief rest period after they'd narrowly escaped another pirate ambush. They're applying constant pressure, hoping we'll make a mistake or run somewhere they can trap us easily. But Rick and his crew had something the hunters didn't expect. They had help. Lisa from Kepler 9 Station Security started calling in favors across her network. Other security personnel at different stations began accidentally giving Rick's pursuers bad information, routing them to the wrong systems or delaying their refueling. Tommy Wu's gray market contacts spread word through the underground that Rick was hauling something important, something that could help regular people, and that the big corporations were trying to steal it. Independent traders started running interference, coincidentally blocking jump routes or creating sensor ghosts that confused pursuit. Even old Breck showed up at one point. His salvage ship, which looked like it could barely fly, somehow managed to intercept a pirate vessel that had gotten too close. Rick watched in amazement as the Quilarians' apparently unarmed salvage ship deployed hidden weapons that blew the pirates' engines clean off. Still bad for my reputation if you die, Breck transmitted before vanishing back into the chaos of the shipping lanes. The running battles took their toll on everyone. Rick's ship collected new scars despite Beth's best efforts, burn marks from near misses and hull stress from emergency maneuvers. Systems that had been perfectly repaired started breaking again under the constant strain, requiring Beth to perform maintenance during portal jumps, working in zero-G while the ship's systems went haywire. Mike barely slept, spending 18 hours a day at the controls, plotting evasive routes and executing maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible in a ship this size. His eyes developed dark circles, and his hands shook from exhaustion and too many stimulant pills. Amy spent all her time on communications, talking to stations they passed, negotiating safe harbor that usually turned out to not be safe at all, and trying to drum up support through sheer force of will and diplomatic skill. And Glimmer proved to be surprisingly useful in ways nobody expected. Resh could perceive electromagnetic fields directly, and Glimmer could sense when ships were powering up weapons or charging jump drive seconds before human sensors detected it. That early warning saved their lives more than once. The worst moment came in week 2. They jumped into what the charts listed as an uninhabited system, hoping to lose their pursuers in the asteroid fields. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by 6 ships, a coordinated trap by the corporate security forces. "We're boxed in," Mike said flatly. "No way out. They've got us." The lead corporate ship hailed them with a message that was polite but firm. "Surrender the ship and its data. Sign contracts giving exclusive rights to New Terra's location and resources. Do it peacefully and everyone walks away rich." Rick looked at his crew. Beth was covered in grease and burns from emergency repairs. Mike looked like he might fall asleep standing up. Amy's diplomatic calm had cracked, showing the exhaustion underneath. Glimmer's usually vibrant colors were dim with fatigue. And Rick thought about the 50,000 people on New Terra who were counting on them. Who trusted Rick to bring help before their portal gate collapsed and they were cut off forever. "We're not surrendering," Rick said quietly. "And we're not signing anything." "Rick, we don't have a choice," Amy said, though she didn't sound like she believed it. "There's always a choice." Rick pulled up the sensor data, studying the corporate ship's positions. They were in a standard containment formation, effective but predictable. And there was one gap, a narrow corridor between two vessels where the overlapping sensor coverage was weakest. "Mike, can you thread that gap?" Rick asked, pointing at the display. Mike studied it, then laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. "Maybe. With a lot of luck and perfect timing. If we miss by even a few meters, we hit their sensor nets and they fry our systems." "Beth, can we boost power to the engines for about 10 seconds without everything exploding?" Beth did rapid calculations. "I can give you 8 seconds. After that, the power core starts melting down." 8 seconds is enough. "Glimmer, I need you watching their weapons. The instant anyone starts charging, you tell us." Glimmer's colors shifted to determined blue. "The rest will watch." Rick took a deep breath. "Amy, when we move, you start broadcasting everything we have. Full transmission, maximum power. Every frequency. New Terra's coordinates, their history, the video messages, all of it. Even if they catch us, the data gets out." "If I do that, every ship in 3 systems will have the information," Amy pointed out. "That's the idea. We can't control who finds New Terra anymore. So we make sure everyone finds it. Let the galaxy decide what happens next." Amy smiled slowly. "You know what? I like that plan." The corporate ships were hailing again, their messages getting more insistent. Rick ignored them. "On my mark," he said. "Mike, get us through that gap. Beth, give us everything. Amy, broadcast everything. Glimmer, be our eyes." Rick waited, watching the corporate ships. They were getting impatient, starting to move closer, adjusting their formation. "Now." Mike's hands flew over the controls. The ship leaped forward with acceleration that pressed everyone back in their seats. Beth pushed the power core to its absolute limits, and Rick could hear alarms screaming warnings about system overload. They shot toward the gap between the 2 corporate vessels, a space so narrow that Rick could see individual hull plates on the enemy ships through the viewport. "Weapons charging," Glimmer called out. But they were already through, the 8 seconds of maximum power carrying them past the containment field before the corporate ships could react. Amy was broadcasting at maximum power, dumping gigabytes of data across every communication channel. Behind them, the corporate ships scrambled to pursue, but they were out of position and Rick's ship had a head start. Mike dove into the asteroid field, using the rocks as cover, and by the time the corporate vessels organized themselves, Rick's ship was gone. They'd escaped. Barely, but they'd escaped. And more importantly, the data was out there now. Spreading across the networks. Within hours, every information broker, news service, and interested party in a dozen systems would know about New Terra. The next week was chaos. Rick's ship received thousands of messages. Some were offers of help. Others were threats. Many were just people asking if it was true, if humanity really had a lost colony that had survived for 2 centuries. Independent ship captains started volunteering to carry supplies to New Terra. Engineering firms offered to donate equipment. Crowdfunding campaigns appeared overnight, raising money to help the colony. Even some alien species, impressed by the story of human-Resh cooperation, pledged support. The corporations and pirates fell back, realizing they couldn't monopolize something that everyone now knew about. The Valyrian military frigate finally gave up and headed home. By the time Rick's ship limped back into Kepler 9 space, barely holding together after 3 weeks of running battles, they had an escort. 50 ships, all volunteers, carrying everything New Terra needed and more. It wasn't an official government mission. It was something better. It was ordinary people from 100 different worlds choosing to help because it was right. Rick led the volunteer fleet back through the route he'd pioneered, retracing his original journey. When they emerged in New Terra's system and the colonists saw 50 ships descending carrying help and hope, the entire planet celebrated. The portal gate repairs took 3 months. Rick stayed to help, working alongside New Terran engineers and learning things about portal technology that nobody else knew. The isolation had forced innovation, and now that knowledge was being shared freely. When the gate finally came back online, stable and stronger than before, Governor Walsh made a speech broadcast across human space. "We survived because we adapted. We thrived because we cooperated. We persevered because we never stopped being human. New Terra isn't just a lost colony found. It's proof that humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons or our technology. It's our refusal to give up on each other. 6 months later, Rick was back on Kepler-9, but everything had changed. His old junker ship sat in a museum now, a symbol of how one person's determination could change the galaxy. He had a new ship, better in every way, purchased with money from a foundation set up by grateful new Terrans. He was still a mechanic, still took odd jobs when he felt like it. But now he ran regular supply missions to New Terra, carrying goods and passengers along the route he'd discovered. The lost colony had become a bridge between Earth and the frontier. His crew had stayed with him. Beth, Mike, Amy, and Glimmer. They'd become family during those desperate weeks. Ready for another run? Amy asked from the co-pilot seat. Rick looked at his new ship, at the crew that had become his family, at the star charts showing New Terra connected to human civilization by trade routes that grew busier every day. He'd started with 5 credits and a joke. Now he'd helped reconnect humanity's lost children to their family, and proved that cooperation was stronger than conquest. Yeah, Rick said, smiling. Let's go home. And as they jumped through the portal, Rick knew he'd found something more valuable than any treasure. He'd found proof that one person really could change everything. He'd found family. He'd found home.